Cool. We're live. Awesome. So thank you all for coming to the webinar. Today is potentially a controversial topic, or at least I've been told that one of the local Facebook groups, we can't post anything to do with it because it gets automatically banned. So it's all about being vaxxed or unvaxxed, your rights and obligations. And before we get into it too much, I just want to give a thank to Business Whangaparoa, Destination Oreo Beach, and Silverdale Business for helping put all this together. My name is Matthew Edwards. I am the Vice Chair for Silverdale Business, so I'll effectively facilitate all of these webinars. And today we have Richard and Jessica, who are directors of the legal team. So I'm going to hand it over to them, and they'll be able to go through everything we can say at the moment. And if you do have any questions while that's happening, on the right-hand side, you have there's a chat poll, but there's also a Q&A section that you can put your questions into, and we'll get to those towards the end. So please make use of it. But until then, Jess and Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's hi everyone. This is a little bit of a vexed question, and since we started and agreed to do this webinar, things have sort of changed a bit, and it's a very dynamic situation. Just to mention, this isn't a pro or anti-government agenda at the moment, but it is very, very difficult because we aren't getting a heck of a lot of guidance from the government, although in the last 48 hours we suddenly got a little bit more, and so and all the preparation that we'd done, we sort of had to revisit, I guess. Jessica is one of my co-directors at the legal team, and this is one of her areas of expertise, although it is a constantly and changing, and in fact probably at the moment there's an announcement going on at 4 o'clock, so by the time we finish this we may be out of date again, who knows. So but I'm very keen to be able to try to give you as much information without going over the top as we can, but equally every situation is slightly different. Every business has a different requirement. So while we want to try and give you as much guidance as we can, every business has different requirements. So just don't go ahead exactly on relying on sort of what's been said here today. You will have to have a look at your own business on that basis. So really I'll hand over to Jessica so that she can actually sort of take you through where we are as we understand it at the moment. Yes.
Thanks, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Richard has said, we spent a lot of time preparing for this, put in some hours over the weekend. We had a wonderful webinar planned for you. And then on Tuesday, 4 o'clock, with the announcement of the COVID protection framework and the traffic light system, everything changes again. So it changes what seems like on a daily basis. Anything that we say today is valid today, and it may change tomorrow. May have already changed in a 4 o'clock announcement this afternoon. In terms of what we are discussing today, it is an overview of the current situation. We aren't able to answer any specific questions about a particular business or scenario. Now, the reasons for that will become clear as we go through. It really has to be considered not only on a business by business basis, but if we're talking about employees, it has to be considered on a role by role basis as well. So you can't just have a blanket one size fits all approach for every business or even every employee within a business. So you will be aware in terms of the government guidance that has been in existence for a while that we do have mandatory vaccinations for certain roles. So those are certain roles within the health and disability sector, the education sector, and in relation to border worker roles. On Tuesday, we got thrown into a bit of a panic because we had the government announcing an extension of the mandate. So the extension of the mandate is now going to cover any worker of a business that requires a vaccination certificate at entry. We're told that this will be approximately 40% of New Zealand businesses, and this is where workers are operating in closed, confined spaces or in close contact with one another, and will include the hospitality sector, and including other sectors such as gyms, barbers, hairdressers, all of those lovely services that we want to get back to using as soon as possible. I'm sure I am. In terms of the guidelines that we've got at the moment, it's if customers are requiring a vaccination to access those services, the workers within those services must also be vaccinated. Now, that still leaves a large group of businesses that are outside of the category of mandatory vaccinations, but still those businesses have the ability to consider using vaccination certificates. That's become particularly relevant with the new COVID protection framework and the traffic light system that we're seeing. So we've got starting at red, going through to orange, and then green. There's different restrictions at each level, and the restrictions will depend on whether your business is using vaccination certificates or whether you're choosing not to use vaccination certificates. At certain levels, if you are not using vaccination certificates, you just won't be able to open. In terms of if you have a business and say you're all office workers, you don't interact with customers and you don't require vaccination certificates to supply your services, you can still consider making vaccines mandatory within the business, but that would depend on your own risk assessment. So businesses have a system of undertaking a risk assessment. That's actually required under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Not everybody's familiar with it, and not everybody has done the risk assessment, but it's been in place for a little while now. There's been some guidance on the Health and Safety website. There's a framework that you can use for preparing the risk assessment. So first step is that risk assessment, and then that flows through into informing your policy as to whether you're going to require these vaccination mandates, I suppose, for your staff. So with the Health and Safety at Work Act and your COVID risk assessment, we would see this across all industries. All businesses will need to undertake it before you can actually make any policy about what you're going to be doing going forward, whether you are going to require your employees to be vaccinated, whether you are going to use vaccination certificates if you're not within that mandatory category, and you use that risk assessment to decide on a role-by-role basis what your different exposures are and your different mitigation strategies. So in terms of the tools that are available for you on the WorkSafe website, there are different risk factors that are laid out quite carefully there. There are lots of different questions that you'll need to answer. I'll go through these generally just as a brief run through, but I do encourage you to have a look at the WorkSafe website as it has been simplified. So part of the announcement yesterday was that they are simplifying, well, the government is simplifying the risk assessment that you will have to undertake. And that does give you an easier way to decide whether you're going to enforce mandatory vaccination, what you're going to do in terms of other mitigation methods. So you need to consider on a role-by-role basis how many people your employee, that particular category or role of employee, would come into contact with. How easy would it be to identify the people that the employee comes into contact with? For example, if you're a professional business and you've got people coming and going, but you know who your clients are, it is easier for you to determine who those people are if something were to happen. But if you've got a walk-up business and you've got lots of people coming and going, you might not necessarily have those people's those customers' details recorded, and you're not easily able to identify who you've come into contact with. You need to decide how close your employees are when carrying out their tasks in proximity to other people, and that's both the customers and other employees. How long does the work require that employee to be in that close proximity to other people? Does the work involve regular interaction with people considered at high risk of severe illness from COVID-19? That could be people with underlying health conditions, the elderly. There's a lot of guidance out there about different risk profiles for the public in terms of COVID. And what is the risk of COVID-19 infection and transmission in the work environment compared to outside work? Is your work office or your environment going to put people at higher risk than they would usually be in their day-to-day lives? So after you've answered all of those questions, record your results. You need to consider other controls that you could potentially implement. We've already got the masks, we've got hand sanitizer, we've got distancing, we've got contact tracing, and you need to consider any other controls and any other things you can do, say moving high-risk people away from front-facing roles, considering people continuing to work from home where they are at a higher risk profile. Once you have considered all of the risk factors, you can start to put together your policy. Guidance says that you need to approach this on a role-by-role basis. It can't just be a one-size-fits-all. And you do need to consult with your employees. So you would need to put it out there for comment, which is sometimes a very difficult thing to do. It is such a highly polarizing issue at the moment. It is quite often hard to have this conversation with your employees, but that consultation is key. So you need to make sure that people have an opportunity to understand and comment on your policy as you're making it. So if you've gone through that whole process, you're not a business that has a mandatory, well, government, at this time, government mandated vaccine certificate requirement, but you've decided that the nature of your role is such that the risk profile and the other mitigation options available to you would indicate that there's no other option available to you, or you feel that the risk is high enough that you would mandate vaccination for your employees, you can put your policy in place. What then if one of your workers says, well, I'm not going to get vaccinated? The government has made some comment on this, but it's still a very evolving situation. It's not entirely clear at this time the exact detail of how we're going to approach this. So for those employees who don't have a COVID provision in their employment agreements, the government has indicated that they are passing law change to bring in a mandatory 4-week termination process for anybody who would lose their job for refusing a vaccination. The change would only apply to employees who don't have this currently in their employment agreement. Once the notice period starts, that employee then has a 4-week period to get vaccinated and show proof of it. Any disclosures made about vaccination status still needs to be treated in accordance with all of the privacy policy obligations, of course. So anything that is disclosed as part of this whole process, you need to make sure that you're keeping that information private and you're protecting it. There have been some stories out there of employers failing to do that, and that is a really good way to come up against the Employment Relations Authority. And you also have other obligations under the Privacy Act if you're dealing with vaccination certificates and your customers' vaccination status as well. So that's something to bear in mind throughout this whole process. So as part of this whole process, employees can still test their rights in court. The government has indicated that they are not going to put businesses at risk of litigation by following vaccine mandates or using your risk assessment guidance. However, it is still something that you need to be mindful of. You've got the obligation to consult with all employees. You've got the obligation to deal with everybody in good faith. and approach this on that role-by-role basis and with individual consultation with employees. There aren't many cases at the moment which have gone through the Employment Relations Authority. We have seen one, which is in relation to border workers, but that will have limited application to most businesses, particularly up here in Silverdale, where we're not border workers, and a lot of us won't fall within the currently mandated categories. So when the new laws come into effect, if the government does pass further law change designating categories of required vaccination, so mandatory vaccination, employers will still have to go through a reasonable process with staff, and that does include considering whether that staff member could be redeployed into another role that doesn't require them to get a vaccination. So do you have any other roles within the business that that person could reasonably be redeployed within that wouldn't require them to have that level of interaction where that role would require being performed by a vaccinated employee? Once you've gone through that whole process, if the employee is not able to be redeployed elsewhere, if you've exhausted all of the available options, the 4-week termination period would start. If they choose not to get vaccinated and the role requires that they're not able to fulfill the conditions of that role, and you would work through the termination process with them. So that's what we know at this time. As I said, it can all change. It's very difficult at the moment to work your way through the different changes. We don't have the law change in effect currently in terms of mandatory vaccination. It's just in there at the moment for the border workers, the health workers, the education sector workers. It will be coming in for hospitality, hairdressers, and some other close contact businesses such as gyms. But we're really lacking detail at this time. Until that legislation is actually passed by the government, we're feeling our way through it, and it's really going to be a matter of watch this space, but do all you can to fulfill your employment obligations first and foremost, and treat things as you usually would for all employment matters on a role-by-role basis with consultation and acting in good faith.
Yeah. So the nub of it really is that your employment arrangements are still in place. They're exactly the same as they were before, but we are getting a little bit more direction from the government. Just in terms of trying to help here, you've still got to do this risk assessment. Every business is supposed to have done a risk assessment. We've had to do a risk assessment in our business, and your risk assessment is sort of for the overall business. Just to try to give you a little bit of guidance with the risk assessment, the most obvious one, obviously, is if employees have underlying medical conditions. That's a pretty obvious one. I was a little bit shocked when I was advised by Jessica that, in fact, I fell into the high risk category due to my age. Couldn't believe that, and potentially the other one is, and I'm not sure whether this is it, is things like weight, whether people are carrying too much weight, and that can be a part of your risk assessment to bringing in non-vaccinated people. There can be higher risk there. So the first thing you've still got to do is your risk assessment in a nub. You've got to do your risk assessment. Once you've done your risk assessment, each employment contract is an individual employment contract with your employees. It's not a general, you can't make one rule fit all. You have to go and hold their hands and talk to each one individually and decide exactly what their risk is and what their employment status is. There are sort of two non-vax or three non-vax people. One of them is somebody who literally cannot be vaxxed, although my understanding on that is that that's going to be a very, very small number. I mean, in New Zealand, we're talking about maybe 100 people who suffer or have a debilitation that won't allow them to be vaxxed. So I think that's going to be quite a small number. And you're pretty unlucky if you do fall into that. We have the anti-vaxxers who simply will not, don't believe that this COVID is an issue and that the vaxxers is a conspiracy by greater government and so on. So that's sort of one issue there. But I think the one that we find most difficult is probably the people who want pro-choice. They're not necessarily anti-vax, but they just don't want to be told what to do, when the reality is we are being told what to do. And ultimately, as part of your risk assessment, you may have to tell your employees what you want them to do, and if they don't, and they can't work in the in the business in a safe environment, then you may have to invoke the four-week clause and just tell them that they have to be vaxxed within the 4-week clause. And Jessica will shoot me for saying this because we've got to be very careful what we say here, but some of the big legal firms and accounting firms you've probably seen in the paper have sort of said no jab, no job. Now, exactly how they're going to carry that out, we're not quite sure yet. It could be that they're saying, look, we're big enough that, anyone who takes us on it'll cost them more than it'll cost us to do that. But I think their view is probably that if a business is taken to the tribunal, because of the indications and the direction that the government's sort of giving us now, people are probably thinking that there's no way that a tribunal is actually going to come down on the side of a person who doesn't want to be vaxxed if there's no good medical reason for not being vaxxed. So that's just trying to give you a little bit of indication of what the thought is, although apart from the border worker, which is in a different category, there are no cases in front of the employment tribunal as yet. So that's sort of where we're at. I know it's a little bit unclear because we're still struggling with that. But I think possibly if we open the floor to questions through Matt, and we will sort of try to give you as much guidance as we can, although you've got to take it on the basis of we're trying to give you guidance without knowing specific fact situations.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Just to, start off with the first question, we've got one here. At this stage, are employers able to ask their staff, contractors, or third parties regarding their vaccination status?
Yes, absolutely. You can certainly ask all employees, contractors, any category, whether they are vaccinated. They can choose not to answer, and you're entitled to assume that they are not vaccinated. Any disclosure that they make to you has to be treated in accordance with your privacy obligations. You wouldn't ask people in a group setting. You would ask them individually, and you would give them the opportunity to respond. If they choose not to respond or they just don't want to say, assume they're not vaccinated. You're entitled to do that. If they say anything about their health status, keep it confidential.
Yeah, and that's as an employer asking the employee. We we sort of see that most of the employees seem to know who is and who isn't themselves. It's through its talk or what it is and so on. So, but from an employer point of view, you do just have to be a little bit careful on that what you're hearing from them and what you're talking to them is on a one-on-one private basis.
Perfect, thank you. Next question we've got here. Is there a recommended protocol for how we establish if we would be deemed to be high risk? Is there a guideline or checklist that we can follow?
So in terms of looking at your health and safety risk assessment, you're going to go on the WorkSafe website and you work your way through the questions. So there's a framework there that you use for your risk assessment, and that will inform whether you are high risk or not high risk. So you just work through the questions. There are certain industries which have been noted as being high risk by the government, and those are fairly well publicised as well. So things like hairdressers, we're in close contact, gyms, we've all heard about these ones.
Okay. And there was a bit of a follow-up question to that, and also relates to the first question. Is that the same process or same procedure for volunteers as it is for employees?
Yes, absolutely. If you've got somebody working in your business, you would ask them about their vaccination status. And they either choose to answer about vaccination or they choose not to. And if they choose not to, you assume that they're not vaccinated.
And it's not just about the person. I mean, you have an obligation to the rest of your staff as well, and hence that's part of your risk assessment. You have to keep your staff safe, and if you're working in an environment where you can't socially distance and there are people at risk, then it's quite likely that you can't actually have a non-vax person there if that is going to be the case.
Okay, thank you. There was another follow-up question to the first one that I asked, and it touches on something that you mentioned earlier with if someone chooses not to disclose their status, their vaccination status, obviously, as an employer, is it legal to assume they're not vaccinated?
Yes.
Yes.
That is the government guidance.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And again, another follow-up question. So it may not have been known yet for events with destination or beats, so with our business, so forth. We work with so many third parties who are not employees or work under any employment contract. How do we manage our/their obligations in the public space?
If you're running an event, once we move, again, we're not talking at the moment, we're talking about the new framework, the traffic light system. Once we move to the traffic light system, if you're holding an event, you need to decide, are you using vaccination certificates, are you not? And the vaccination certificates would be applicable to all of your partners, the people who are coming in and being part of this event. If you're using your vaccination certificates, it's blanket and you need that vaccination certificate from everybody who's participating in the event. And that would answer, are they vaccinated or are they not?
And I mean, I think, it's fair to say it is going to be a little bit of a nightmare in the sense that if you are one of those like Lindy at a hair scene or someone like that, I mean, it has been mandated that you can only have vax people in there. It is a situation, but in a lot of other areas, and we just don't quite know where they are at the moment, but retail would be an example. I mean, do you stop everyone at the door and ask them whether they're double vaxxed? Do you require a vaccine certificate? And there is going to be a little bit of aggro, I think, from a lot of people, and we've already seen this in other in other situations where there are fisticuffs at the door and they don't, they want to come in and you can't stop them. The reality is, though, that this is your business. You have to keep your staff safe, and so you are entitled to make those mandates.
I think that somewhat answers one of the questions that we had in the chat there, which is how are we going to know whether clients that come into a hair salon, for example, are vaxxed or unvaxxed?
Yeah. At the traffic light system, you will be required to use vaccination certificates. You're going to have to ask everybody. No vaccination certificate, you can't get your hair done.
There's just no choice on that. I mean, that is mandated, and there's no. It's the trickier ones is where there aren't a mandate sort of thing. And now, of course, there are going to be all sorts of issues, as we all know, that getting fake certificates and this, that, and the next thing and so on. That's going to be another issue altogether. But I mean, on the basis that you do have to ask them for that certificate because that is part of the mandate. And I think if it's non-mandated, you still have the. If it's your business, you can still, if you make your policy that you do want to have only double vax people coming in, then you're entitled to that. It's your business. You can do what you need to do there.
Thank you.
It's not always that easy because obviously you still want everyone to come in and buy stuff and do business. And, we have exactly the same problem. We're no smarter than anybody else in this situation. People without vaccine spend as well as people who do with vaccine, but you've just got to be very careful on that.
There was, this one's a bit more specific, but it probably does apply to quite a few people. So the question goes, my business is probably a vaccine certificate required. However, I have some back of the house positions that have where the team has zero customer contact. Based on a risk assessment, they will not be required to be vaccinated, but under a mandate, they would. So I guess the question really comes in and says, what takes priority?
we're going to need to know the details of the mandate first. It's not into law yet. That's half of the problem. We're a bit crystal ball gazing here. It will depend on the actual detail of the law change that's passed. If the law change is passed and says that every employee of your particular business is required to be vaccinated, then that's the answer. If it's mandated by the government, they have to be vaccinated or you can't trade. If the government comes forward and says only these particular roles within this industry must be vaccinated, well, then that's the answer, and you can use your risk assessment for the remainder of the roles within that business.
Yeah.
Cool. Just following on with that one, there was a question about timing. So regarding the timing, do you think the 4-week clause will start from when we move to the traffic light system, or does this process with the employee need to be completed before we operate under the new level?
So again, we're crystal ball gazing because the law change has not been passed yet. It is in process. It was announced yesterday. I understand that you would be able to start the wheels rolling on this prior to the traffic light system coming into effect.
Yeah.
There is the possibility that the traffic light system would be implemented in different areas of the country as well. So they are going to pass the law changes prior to the traffic light system coming into effect. So we've got that framework to work within. And we'll have more detail about when this 4-week period starts. My understanding is that if you had completed your risk assessment now,
and that's the key, you've got to do your risk assessment first.
Yep, and you have decided that the risk profile of your business is such that you are going to require mandatory vaccinations, then you can advise your employees of that fact and start that 4-week process.
Perfect. So there's another question that's popped up. Well, okay, 2 questions that have popped up in the Q&A. We have one that's just asking to repeat the COVID clause for the employee contract. I'm assuming that's around the 4-week part and what that means. So
it will depend on whether you've got existing employees with no COVID clause in. You've got some employees who have been around long before the pandemic was ever a thought. In that case, the government is going to bring in a mandatory 4-week notice period. Some businesses have included COVID clauses in their new employment agreements or have done variations for employees to include COVID clauses. In that case, if you've already got one in there, that will guide you.
What's an example of a COVID clause, Jess?
So some businesses have dealt with lockdowns and the ability for the staff to work. Some have said in the event that you aren't able to work, your job is not able to be performed remotely. For example, a retail worker where they're from a mall, they don't have the ability to trade online. There's just simply no business. They can't trade. And the COVID clause in those agreements would say, in the event that we have a lockdown and we're not able to trade, you will not have any work available to you, and accordingly, you won't be paid. So that's one example of a particular COVID clause. There are also some others of late, recently, where employees and employers are agreeing that the role requires vaccination, and have put in a time frame for that to occur for those who are not yet vaccinated. So I suppose that's what I'm talking about, where I say if there is a COVID clause in the agreement which says, yep, this role must be performed by a vaccinated person,
then you can rely on it.
Then you can rely on it.
There aren't a lot of those around at this stage.
Not a lot, no, not a lot. But those who are hiring at the moment have been considering it and including it in their agreements.
Yep.
Okay, so to confirm a couple of points that I was picking up and to answer the next question, it doesn't sound like we need to update existing contracts and put people on new contracts. Is that correct?
That is correct. For existing contracts, you can choose to run with what you've got. Or if you have particular concerns and you want to address those for your business, you can negotiate a variation of existing contracts with the employees, but it has to be done with full negotiation with the employees, has to be done in good faith. You can't just unilaterally impose a change. As with any change to employment terms and conditions, it's done with full consultation and the employee has to agree.
Yeah, although the government is, we think, mandating this 4-week vaccine and so on. So that would, you don't need to change your employment contract for there, because that is going to be, we think, put into law.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the law change will trump any existing arrangement in employment contracts.
Yeah,
perfect. Cool. And a question's come up from one of the statements you've just made, actually.
Oh no.
Can employers decide not to pay their employees if they're unable to trade? Isn't that where the wage subsidy would kick in?
Yes, absolutely. It's a bit of a vexed question. There are some businesses who have included a shutdown clause. Those have not been tested yet by the Employment Relations Authority. We don't have case law on them. Do so at your own risk.
But at this stage, I mean, the way it's been working is, and this has been, it's a bit of a misunderstanding. I mean, one can't simply put people on 80% of wage, you receive the wage subsidy, even if they're using the full wage subsidy for the payment of that employee. You can't just unilaterally put people onto a lesser than 100%. Again, I know this sounds ridiculous, but I mean, that has to be done by negotiation. And I mean, the quid pro quo is you say, well, if you don't, we might fold. And, you know, if you don't take 70%, 80%, whatever the figure is, and 80% is just that sort of misnomer figure that's come up. But the reality is that there's no right unilaterally for an employer to drop salaries to 80%. That has to be by agreement between the individual employees and the employer.
I do know that the Restaurant Association, for example, has started including a clause in their standard agreements. So if you are part of the hospitality sector and you are a member of the Restaurant Association, you can ask them about their clause that they're including, which applies for reduction in wages and shutdowns as a result of the pandemic. It might be quite useful for you to hear industry-specific guidance on that.
I think one is going to have to be a little bit careful also. I mean, you know, our friend Leo Malloy from headquarters in town, he's going to make non-vax persons wear a red T-shirt and vax people have a green one and only unvaxxed people outside. So, but Leo is a bit of a law unto himself, and he's not always correct, even though, you know, he does it with the best of intentions. So you do have to be careful. You can't overtly differentiate between people just because they are, because they aren't. Really, the situation is either they can work there and they work as part of your staff, or they can't work there and it just won't work. But you can't get them to wear a different coloured T-shirt to show that they're vaxxed or unvaxxed. You're back with us, Matt.
Has just cut out again. So I apologize for that. It doesn't look like any additional questions have come through, although if they have, I'm sorry, they just haven't loaded on my side. So we might as well sort of wrap it up unless you've got a few last remarks you'd like to make.
No, I just think it's what and this drives me mad, by the way, but it is a individual employment arrangement. You can't have a blanket, even though it does turn into a bit of a blanket, but it's not. You have to do your risk assessment. Drives you mad. You've got to go through this risk assessment, and there are a whole lot of questions that you look at. Do your risk assessment. Are you high risk or are they high risk? Are individual jobs high risk, low risk? If they're high risk, then you can negotiate on a one-on-one basis, and it looks like you can require the people to get that 4 week. You give them 4 weeks to get the vaccination, but you've got to do the risk assessment. Otherwise, you could be leaving yourself open to a potential claim by an employee if that is what you want. If that's what happens.
Perfect. Yeah. So, one last little point. How can people get in touch with you if they want to speak to you about their specific circumstance and get more information direct from you guys?
We were sort of I won't say a startup business, because we started up in April. Jessica and myself and two of the other solicitors I've been in Nauru for 20 years, as has Nicolene, and so we just sort of moved its practice with like-minded people into the new place. It's called the Legal Team. We're on the Silverdale Parkway, on the corner of Silverdale Parkway and Milner Avenue. So yeah, our website is www.thelegalteam.co.nz. We can all be contacted through there if that's the easiest way of doing it. And yeah, no, obviously very happy to see where we can help.
Perfect. All right. So there was one other question that came through, but I can answer that one. Yes, the webinar is being recorded, and it will go up on the Silverdale Business YouTube channel, and we'll post links to that on social media, as well as it being posted on the Silverdale Business website. So once that's up and running, it'll probably take about a week to get it uploaded there, or a couple of days at least. But you are able to watch that back and revisit parts that you have missed or want re-clarification on. Otherwise, do get in touch with Richard and Jessica. I'm sure they're more than willing to help out.
Yep, no, absolutely. So, and honestly, our sympathy goes out. We're in exactly the same position. We have the same sort of situation at work. We have some people are, some people aren't, some people can't at this stage. And it's it's a minefield. We have to step our way through it as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate all the questions and the engagement that we've had here. Do keep it all alive by having a chat with Richard and Jessica. Fire through any other questions or any topics you'd like to see for future webinars to info@silverdalebusiness.co.nz. And if you'd like to run one yourself, by all means, let us know what you'd like to talk about, and we can work out something. But until then, thank you, and we'll see you later.
Brilliant. Bye-bye.